The radio had been repeating the same transmission for 11 minutes before I realized no one was speaking into it. The voice that crackled through the static was not a voice at all. It was something wearing the shape of language the way a hand wears a glove. And when I pressed the receiver to my ear and listened closer, I understood that the words were not coming from any tower or relay station within the park. They were coming from below. From somewhere deep beneath the limestone arch that had stood over Cedar Creek for 215 million years, older than memory, older than bone, older than the first creature that ever crawled from water onto stone and learned to breathe. I drove the blade into the stone. My grandfather told me about this place when I was a boy, Greenwood said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful posture of a man accustomed to being listened to. He said the bridge was not carved by water. He said it was carved by something trying to climb out. Then the stone opened. It said, "Home." He left a small bundle on the porch railing before he drove away. Inside the cloth wrapping, I found a knife with a handle carved from bone. The blade was old, pitted with age, but still sharp enough to draw blood when I tested it carelessly against my thumb. There was an inscription on the handle, symbols I did not recognize, worn smooth in places but still legible if you held the bone at the right angle to the light. Greenwood and Big LaFleur exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in the space of a single heartbeat. And then Greenwood said a word that I had never heard before, but that settled into my memory like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward that would not stop for a very long time. Then you should know what that means. The knife was made from the creature's rib. Bone remembers its body the way the stone remembers its sounds. By carrying that knife, you have been speaking to the Nashobatek in a language you do not understand. You have been telling it where you are. Every moment of every day since you first touched it, the creature has known your exact location. I asked them what they believed was responsible for the missing hiker. The first week passed without incident, unless you count the silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a forested valley in early autumn, where the air carries the sound of water and wind and the slow percussion of leaves releasing from their branches. This was a different kind of silence, a listening silence. The kind that falls over a room when someone has said something terrible and everyone present is waiting to see who will respond first. I felt it most acutely in the evenings when the light withdrew from the gorge and the limestone walls of the bridge turned from gold to gray to something that was not exactly shadow but behaved like it, pooling in the crevices and hollows of the stone as if it were a liquid being poured from above. 4 marks, each one exactly 3 inches apart. The depth consistent from beginning to end, which meant that whatever had made them had not been dragging or tearing but gripping, holding on, the way a hand grips a rope, the way fingers close around a wrist. We found his backpack at the bottom of a ravine near the creek. The straps had been torn, not cut, and the fabric was marked with parallel gouges that the search coordinator initially attributed to a fall against exposed rock. But the gouges were too evenly spaced, too precisely aligned, and when I knelt beside the pack and measured the distance between them with my fingers, I felt something cold settle into the base of my spine and begin to climb. I told him I did. I retrieved it from the desk drawer and placed it beside his bundle, and when the 2 objects were side by side, I noticed something that I had missed before. The symbols on the knife handle were the same as the symbols pressed into the deerskin wrapping. Not similar, identical. As if they had been carved by the same hand, at the same time, for the same purpose. Hushmataha looked at me with those creek water eyes, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that might have been sorrow. I did not look behind me. The silence that followed was not the listening silence I had felt during my first weeks at the park. It was the silence of something that had already heard what it needed to hear, and was now deciding what to do about it. I did not look behind me. Tankasila, who had arrived quietly while Nitakachi was speaking and had been standing in the doorway without announcing himself, stepped into the room. He was a man of medium height with silver hair pulled back from a face that was simultaneously gentle and unyielding, like a river that looks calm on the surface but runs deep enough to drown in. Big LaFleur shifted in his seat, and the chair groaned under his weight. "Something broke those seals," he said. 2 seasons ago, maybe 3. The thing that was down there is not down there anymore. Nitakachi had brought with him a bundle wrapped in deerskin that he placed on the table without ceremony or explanation. When I asked what was inside, he looked at me with eyes that were so steady they seemed to be looking out from a place where time did not move at all. I descended the Cascade Trail with the bone knife in my right hand and a flashlight in my left, though I turned the flashlight off after the first 100 yards because the moonlight was sufficient and because the beam attracted moths that kept landing on my face and hands, their wings brushing my skin with a persistence that felt less like instinct and more like intention. The forest was alive with sound, but none of it was right. The creek below me should have been audible from the trail, its water moving over rocks and fallen branches with the steady murmur that is one of the most comforting sounds in the natural world. But I could not hear it. Instead, I heard breathing, not my own. Something else. Something large, something patient, something that was matching its respiration to the rhythm of my footsteps so precisely that if I stopped walking, the breathing stopped too, and if I resumed, it resumed in perfect synchronization, as if the creature and I were connected by a cord that transmitted motion as sound. But it was the face that destroyed something inside me. Something that has never been rebuilt. The face was canine, a long, narrow muzzle filled with teeth that were too white and too even, like the teeth of a mannequin. But the eyes were human, completely, unmistakably, horribly human. And they were filled with an expression that I recognized, because I had seen it before, in the faces of lost hikers and frightened children, and people who have realized too late that they are somewhere they should not be. Apukshanubi was the last to arrive, and his arrival changed the nature of the gathering in a way that I did not immediately understand but felt in the same wordless, visceral manner that a person feels the approach of a storm before the first cloud appears on the horizon. He was a compact, powerfully built man who walked with a limp that he made no effort to disguise, and his left hand was wrapped in a bandage that was stained with something that was not blood, but that shared blood's reluctance to wash away completely. He looked at each person in the room, counted them silently, and then looked at me. "And what happens to me?" I asked. I had been assigned to Natural Bridge as a seasonal ranger in early September, transferred from a post in the Blue Ridge that had been downsized due to budget cuts. The park was understaffed. The previous ranger assigned to the Northern Trail section had left abruptly in late August, citing personal reasons in his resignation letter, though the superintendent told me privately that the man had been found wandering State Route 11 at 3 in the morning, barefoot, carrying his uniform folded neatly in his arms, as if he were returning it to someone. He had refused to explain what had driven him from the station, and by the time I arrived, no one had heard from him in 2 weeks. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped. The voices stopped. I did not understand what he meant. Not then. "I have been tracking this thing for 6 years, he said, anchoring the corners of a topographic map with coffee mugs and a box of ammunition. "Across 4 states. Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. It follows the limestone. Always the limestone. It uses the cave systems the way we use highways, moving underground between surface locations, emerging where the rock is thin enough to breach." That was the first entry. There would be 47 more before the end, and by the last one, my handwriting had changed so completely that the investigators who found the logbook initially believed it had been written by 2 different people. They were not entirely wrong. And behind me, the Nashaba tech screamed back. I asked him what he meant. "Before I tell you what happened at Natural Bridge State Park in the autumn of that year, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are listening to this right now, whatever city or town or stretch of highway you are passing through, whatever hour the clock on your wall is showing, I want you to pause for just a moment and consider how well you truly know the ground beneath your feet, not the surface, not the grass or asphalt or floorboards. I mean the stone underneath, the ancient architecture of the earth itself. Because what I learned during those weeks in the Shenandoah Valley is that the ground remembers everything that has ever walked upon it, and some of those memories have teeth. The station itself sat on a ridge overlooking the gorge, a single-story structure with a tin roof and windows that faced the tree line on 3 sides. The 4th side, the south wall, had no windows at all. When I asked the maintenance crew why, A man named Gerald, who had worked at the park for 22 years, looked at me as if the answer should have been obvious and said, "Because that is the side that faces the bridge at night." I looked down at the knife lying on the table. The bone handle seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight, as if something beneath the surface of the material was breathing. I thought about the radio transmission I had heard during my first week, the voice that had come from below, the voice that was not a voice but something wearing the shape of language. And I thought about the night when something on the south side of the station had spoken my name in a voice that sounded almost like Thomas Calloway. And in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Something that I had been hearing since my first day at the station but had never been able to identify. A low, continuous tone that was not quite sound, and not quite vibration but something between the two, coming from inside the stone itself. The bridge was humming. It had been humming for 215 million years, and the note it was producing was the exact frequency of a human vocal cord stretched to its limit. "They became footprints," he said. "Human footprints, size 14, barefoot, and they walked, in a straight line, directly toward this station." I set the radio down on the desk and stared at it until the transmission stopped. Then I picked up my logbook and wrote the date, the time, and a single sentence that I would read again months later with hands that could no longer hold a pen steady. The sentence read, "Something beneath the bridge is learning to talk." "You are carrying the bone knife," he said. Like Nitakachi, it was not a question. I placed the knife in the top drawer of my desk and did not think about it again for 12 days. That night, Musha Latubi and Jack went out along the North Trail to lay sensor equipment and trail cameras. They returned 3 hours later, and Jack's face had changed. Not his expression, his actual face. The color had drained from it so completely that, in the lamplight of the station, his skin looked like wet paper. When I asked him what had happened, he looked at his brother, and Peter nodded. "We found tracks," Jack said, "on the slope above the creek bed, about a quarter mile from the bridge. They started on 4 legs, a canine gait, but wrong. The stride was too long, the weight distribution too heavy for any known species, and then, at the base of a sycamore tree, the tracks changed. I did not look behind me. I asked him what the next closest thing was. The creature released the knife. It turned to me. And in that voice, that almost human, not quite human, terrible and pitiful voice, it said a word that I will hear every night for the rest of my life. The creature does not kill because it is hungry," Folsom read, turning pages with fingers that were careful and precise. "It kills because it is incomplete. It is something that was made wrong, or made for a purpose that no longer exists, and it moves through the world looking for the piece of itself that is missing. The old one said it was once a man, a warrior who asked the spirits for the strength of every animal in the forest, and the spirits granted his wish but took his humanity as payment. Now it is neither man nor animal. It is the space between the two, and that space is a kind of hunger that nothing can fill." And then, in a voice that sounded almost but not quite like Thomas Calloway, the missing hiker, something on the other side of the wall said my name. Within the next 9 days, 2 more people went missing from the trails. A young couple from Lynchburg who had been hiking the Cedar Creek Trail and whose camera was found wedged into a crevice in the limestone 40 feet above the water, as if it had been placed there deliberately by something that could scale vertical rock. And an elderly woman named Margaret Saunders, a birdwatcher who had been visiting the park weekly for 15 years, and who, according to her husband, had called him from the overlook at 11 in the morning to tell him she had seen something extraordinary, something she could not describe over the phone, something she needed him to come see for himself. By the time he arrived at the park, she was gone. Her binoculars were hanging from a branch at the edge of the trail, the strap unbroken, as if she had removed them carefully and placed them there the way you might hang a coat on a hook before entering a room where coats were not permitted. Natural Bridge is one of the most photographed geological formations in the eastern United States. It rises 215 feet above Cedar Creek, a limestone arch so massive that Thomas Jefferson once purchased it from King George III for 20 shillings, believing it to be one of the most sublime natural wonders on the continent. For centuries, the Monacan people regarded it as a sacred site, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits grew thin enough to whisper through. The Choctaw people, who had traveled through these mountains long before the forced relocations of the 1830s, had another name for it. They called it It-e-Vabsa, which translates roughly as the mouth that does not close. Callaway was never found. Tunkasila nodded. It has heard everyone's name. Every person who has ever stood on that bridge and spoken aloud. Every ranger who has ever called home from this station. Every child who has ever shouted into the gorge to hear the echo. The stone collected all of it, and the creature has been listening for centuries. The stone remembers what the flesh forgets, he said again. When this is over, you will understand what that means. I raised the knife. The bone handle was so hot that it burned my palm, and I could feel the inscription on its surface changing under my fingers, the symbols rearranging themselves into a pattern that I could not see but could feel. A pattern that spelled something in a language that predated speech. He paused. The silence in the room was the kind that has physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders and chest like the air before a summer storm. Next came Mushalatubi, a tracker whose reputation I had already heard mentioned in low voices by the search and rescue volunteers. He was an older man, weathered and spare, with a body that looked as if it had been built from the same materials as the forest floor, all sinew and root and compressed earth. He could read a trail the way a linguist reads a manuscript, extracting meaning from impressions so faint that they were invisible to anyone who had not spent a lifetime learning the language of disturbed soil and bent grass. When he examined the area where Margaret Saunders had vanished, he spent 40 minutes on his hands and knees before standing up and delivering his assessment in a single sentence. The bridge screamed. Folsom arrived that evening, a historian and keeper of records, whose knowledge of the Choctaw oral tradition was so comprehensive that Peter described him as a living archive. Folsom was a meticulous man who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and carried a leather journal in which he had transcribed, over the course of 30 years, every account of the Nashobatek that he had been able to locate in the spoken histories of the nation. He sat at the station table and read excerpts aloud while the rest of us listened. And as his voice filled the room with stories that were hundreds of years old, I began to understand that what was happening at Natural Bridge was not new. It was not even unusual. It was a cycle, and the cycle had been repeating for longer than anyone alive could remember. We began at midnight. The moon was 3/4 full, and its light fell into the gorge at an angle that turned the limestone walls into a cathedral of silver and shadow. Every crack and fissure thrown into sharp relief, every surface gleaming with the cold luminosity of something that had been waiting a very long time to be seen. The air temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, but the stone beneath my boots was warm, almost uncomfortably so, as if the bridge were running a fever. It heard my name in the stone, I said. You will drive the knife into the stone of the bridge itself, into the arch, into the oldest part of the limestone, where the memory is deepest, and when the bone meets the stone, the ceremony will begin, and the rest of us will do what must be done. The first disappearance was reported on a Friday. A hiker named Thomas Callaway, 61 years old, retired schoolteacher from Roanoke, had entered the park at the main trailhead at 7:30 in the morning and never returned to the parking lot where his car sat undisturbed with a thermos of coffee still warm on the passenger seat. Search and rescue was deployed by 3 in the afternoon, and I joined the team working the eastern slope of the gorge, moving through a forest of oak and hickory that had begun its autumn transformation, the canopy overhead shifting from green to copper to a deep, unsettling red that made the light filtering through the leaves look like something seen through stained glass in a cathedral built for a congregation that no longer existed. I heard my name, spoken in the voice of Thomas Callaway, then spoken again in the voice of Margaret Saunders, then in voices I did not recognize, voice after voice, name after name, as if the creature were cycling through every sound the stone had ever recorded, searching for the one that would make me turn. That knife was made from the rib of the first Nashoba ever killed, Nitakachi said. 300 seasons ago, when my ancestor's ancestor tracked one to its den below the stone bridge and drove a spear through its chest while it slept. But it did not die the way an animal dies. It died the way a fire dies. It went out, and the smoke of it went into the ground, and the ground carried it down into the places where the stone is still warm from the making of the world. "Your voice," he said. "It takes your voice." The creature lunged. Not at me, at the knife. It threw itself toward the arch with a speed that my eyes could not track, and I saw its hand close around the bone handle and pull, and the stone resisted, and the creature pulled harder, and the bridge screamed again, and the chanting above me grew louder, and from every point around the gorge, from Mushalatubi's position on the north ridge and the Pitchlin brothers on the trail, and the LaFloras at the eastern approach, and Tunkasila and Apukshanubi at the water's edge, voices joined the chant. 10 voices becoming one voice, becoming something that was not a voice at all but a vibration, a frequency, a counternote to the hum of the bridge that had been resonating since before anything on this earth had learned to scream. The room went cold. Not metaphorically. The temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath forming in the air between my face and the lamp. And from somewhere outside, somewhere below the station, somewhere in the gorge where the limestone walls descended into the lightless throat of the earth, something howled. It was not the howl of a wolf or a coyote or any animal that belongs in these mountains. It was the sound of a voice trying to become a howl, or a howl trying to become a voice, and the distance between the two was the exact width of every nightmare I had ever had about the thing that waits in the space between waking and sleep. The thing that watches from behind the moment when your eyes close and the moment when the world goes away. That was my mistake. One of many. "And when it comes close enough?" I asked. It stood 15 feet behind me, framed in the moonlight, and it was exactly what Greenwood LaFleur had described, and nothing like what Greenwood LaFleur had described, because no words, no matter how carefully chosen, can prepare you for the reality of something that should not exist. It was tall. Taller than any man. Its body was covered in coarse, grayish fur that moved independently of the wind, each strand seeming to search the air for something the way the antennae of an insect search for scent. Its legs were wrong, jointed at angles that allowed it to shift from bipedal to quadruped with a single fluid motion, and its arms hung past its knees, ending in hands that were too large and too articulated, with fingers that bent backward at the second knuckle. I reached the arch. The stone was warm under my hand when I pressed my palm against it, warm and vibrating faintly, the way a living thing vibrates, with the steady tremor of a pulse that has been beating for longer than anything on the surface has been alive. He traced a line on the map with his finger, connecting a series of red dots that he had marked at irregular intervals along the spine of the Appalachian chain. Each dot represented a cluster of disappearances, and when I looked at the pattern they formed, I felt the same cold recognition that had seized me when I measured the gouges on Thomas Calloway's backpack. The dots were not random. They formed a route, a migration path, and the path ended here, at Natural Bridge, at the place the old Choctaw had called the mouth that does not close. "It carried her," he said, "on 2 legs, running, north, toward the bridge." "It imitates," Greenwood said. "That is what makes it more dangerous than any predator you have encountered. A bear wants your food. A mountain lion wants your flesh. The Nashobatek wants something else entirely. It wants to be understood, and when it cannot achieve that, it takes the next closest thing." "The stone remembers what the flesh forgets," Nitakachi said, repeating the same words Pushmataha had spoken to me weeks earlier. "This is not a saying, it is an instruction. The limestone of this bridge has recorded every vibration, every footstep, every sound that has ever occurred in this gorge since the stone was formed. It is the largest memory in the world, and the Nashobatek knows how to read it." That night, alone in the station, I heard something moving on the south side of the building, the side with no windows. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened, and what I heard was footsteps, not the padding of an animal's paws or the scratching of claws on wood. Footsteps, deliberate, measured, bipedal footsteps that circled the building once, then twice, then stopped directly on the other side of the wall from where I stood. Not the high, sharp sound of fracturing rock. A scream, a voice. A single, enormous, anguished voice that erupted from the stone and filled the gorge with a sound so vast and so old that it did not register as noise but as pressure, as weight, as the physical sensation of 200 million years of accumulated memory being released in a single exhalation. "That is why it imitates," Tankasila said, picking up where Nitakachi had left off, as if they were two instruments playing the same piece of music. It presses itself against the stone and listens to everything the stone has absorbed, every voice, every conversation, every name ever spoken within range of the rock. And then it uses what it has learned to draw people closer. The following Monday, I received a visit from two men who introduced themselves as Greenwood LaFleur and his cousin, Big LaFleur. Greenwood was a quiet man with a scholar's bearing and careful speech, the kind of person who chose each word the way a mason chooses each stone, testing its weight and fit before setting it into place. Big LaFleur was everything his name suggested, a man who seemed to occupy more space than physics should have allowed, broad across the shoulders and chest, with hands that looked capable of bending iron and a voice so deep that when he spoke, I could feel the vibration in the floorboards beneath my boots. The eyes were afraid. "Nashabatek," he said. "The dog that walks like a man." I heard footsteps. 2 legs, then 4, then 2 again. The transitions were fluid, accompanied by a sound that I can only describe as the noise cartilage makes when it is compressed and released rapidly. A wet, mechanical clicking that repeated with each shift in the creature's posture, as if its body were rearranging itself around a central axis that was not bone but something else. Something that bent without breaking in ways that bone cannot. I asked him if he was talking about a bear. Black bears were common in the area, and a large male moving through the gorge at night would explain tracks on the trails. Pushmata looked at me with an expression that contained neither judgment nor pity, but something closer to patience, the kind a man shows when he knows the person in front of him is about to learn a lesson that cannot be taught with words. The creature was afraid of me. He told me the stories had existed for longer than anyone could trace. Accounts of a creature that moved through the deep forests of the eastern woodlands, taller than any wolf, broader than any man, with a body that seemed to shift between quadruped and biped depending on its purpose. When it hunted, it ran on 4 legs, low to the ground, faster than any animal in the canopy. When it wanted something else, something beyond meat and bone, it stood upright and walked with a gait so close to human that from a distance, in low light, you might mistake it for a neighbor coming through the trees. But the proportions were wrong. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long. And the face, if you could call it a face, was the face of something that had studied human expressions the way a student studies a foreign alphabet, learning the shapes without understanding the meaning behind them. Pukshanubi looked at the others. Greenwood looked away. Peter closed his eyes. And it was Folsom, the historian, the keeper of records, who answered. "Something has been using those trails at night," he said, standing on the porch of the station with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. "Something that walks on 4 legs when it wants to be fast, and 2 legs when it wants to be seen. Not cracked, not collapsed. Opened. The way a mouth opens, the way a wound opens. The limestone at the base of the arch separated along a seam that had not existed a moment before. And from below, from the place where the memory was deepest, a wind rose that smelled of minerals and time and something else, something organic, something that had been breathing in the lightless spaces beneath the valley for longer than the bridge had been standing." Peter Perkins Pitchlynn introduced me to the rest of the team over the following 2 days. His brother, Jack Pitchlynn, arrived first. A younger man with the same sharp features and measured speech, but with an energy about him that was different, coiled and watchful, like someone who had learned to live in a permanent state of readiness. Jack had served in the military before returning to the nation, and he moved through the forest with a silence that was less learned than inherited, as if the trees themselves parted for him. What must be done involved the 9 of them positioned at specific points around the gorge, each one holding a piece of the ceremonial bundle that Nitakachi had brought, each one speaking words that Folsom had transcribed from oral accounts that were older than the written history of the continent. Mushalatubi would be on the North Ridge, reading the tracks in real time, guiding the others through signals that mimicked bird calls so precisely that the creature would not recognize them as human communication. Jack and Peter Pitchlynn would flank the trail at the descent, armed not with weapons but with bundles of sage and sweetgrass that would create a corridor of scent the creature could not cross without revealing its true form. Greenwood and Big LaFleur would hold the eastern approach, their massive frames positioned like living pillars at the point where the creek trail met the base of the arch. Tunkasila and Apukshanubi would be below, at the water's edge, where the stone was thinnest and the boundary between the surface world and whatever lay beneath was at its most fragile. And Nitakachi would be on the bridge itself, directly above me, performing the central invocation that would bind the creature to the bone and the bone to the stone. "You have the bone knife," he said. It was not a question. Underneath the bridge, underneath the limestone, there are caves that have never been mapped, tunnels that run deeper than any survey has measured. The Choctaw who traveled through this valley hundreds of years ago knew about those tunnels. They left warnings carved into the stone at every entrance they could find, and then they sealed them. Not with rock, with ceremony, with words that were older than the language they spoke, words they had inherited from the people who came before them, and the people who came before those people, going back so far that no one remembered who first spoke them. They only remembered that the words worked. Nitakachi arrived the following morning. He was the oldest member of the group, a man whose age I could not estimate because his body seemed to exist outside the normal relationship between years and deterioration, lean and strong in a way that suggested not fitness but preservation, as if the same forces that kept the limestone arch standing for 200 million years had found a way to work on human tissue as well. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the others fell silent with a deference that was not merely respectful but instinctive, the way animals grow still when they sense a change in atmospheric pressure that their conscious minds have not yet registered. It was during my second week that I met Pushmataha. He arrived at the station on a Tuesday morning, driving a truck so old that the manufacturer's emblem had been worn smooth by decades of weather, leaving only a circular impression in the metal like the ghost of a coin pressed into clay. He was a tall man, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had been carved by years of wind and sun into something that resembled the landscape itself. His eyes were the color of creek water in November, and when he looked at you, you had the distinct impression that he was not seeing your face but rather something behind it, something you yourself could not reach no matter how far inward you searched. Now, before I continue, I need to say something directly to you. If you are still listening to this, if you have followed me this far into what happened in that valley, then you are the kind of person who does not turn away from the things that others prefer to leave in silence. And that is exactly the kind of person I need right now, because the truth is that what I am about to tell you has never been told in full before, and the fact that you are here, giving this your time and your attention, means more than I can properly express. So if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, if you have not yet hit the like button or left a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight, I am asking you to do that now, not later, not after, right now. Take a moment and do it. Because the channels that bring you these stories, Mr. Bellico, Sir Belliceocho, Mr. Geronimo, Frostvale, Eternal Darkness, Midnight Stories, Echo Horror Files, and the Parkkeeper Stories, they survive because listeners like you choose to support them. And this particular story, the one I am telling you right now, is one that needs to be heard. So make sure you are part of the reason it reaches someone else. Because the only way to end the cycle is to bring the bone back to the creature, he said. And the only person who can carry it close enough is someone the creature already believes is prey. The bone knife rattled on the table. Why did Pushmataha give it to me? I asked. The stone remembers what the flesh forgets, he said. You will understand that before this season ends. I am only asking that you remember it when the time comes. The plan, as Pushmataha explained it when he returned to the station the following evening, was older than the English language. It had been passed down through generations of Choctaw medicine keepers, refined and adapted but never fundamentally altered, because the creature it was designed to defeat did not change. The Neshoba tech was not an evolving thing. It did not learn or grow or adapt the way living beings did. It was a fixed point of hunger, a wound in the world that had never healed, and the ceremony required to close it was itself a kind of wound, a deliberate breaking of something in order to set it properly. You will carry the knife down to the bridge at midnight, Pushmataha said. You will walk the Cascade Trail alone, and you will not look behind you no matter what you hear. The creature will follow. It cannot help itself. The bone calls to it the way a mother's heartbeat calls to a child in the womb. It will come close, closer than it has come to any living person in 100 years, because it believes you are bringing back the piece of itself that was taken. I turned. I know Pushmataha had told me not to. But when the bridge screamed, and when the creature screamed in answer, the cord between us pulled taut, and something in my body responded before my mind could stop it, and I turned, and I saw it. They told me they were part of the same community as Pushmataha, Choctaw families with roots in the region that predated the park, the state and the nation that had drawn lines across land it did not own, and called those lines borders. Greenwood said they had come because they had heard about the missing hiker, and because they had been hearing other things as well, things in the forest that did not belong there. He unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a collection of objects that I recognized as ceremonial but could not identify by specific purpose. There were pouches of dried herbs, bundles of feathers bound with sinew, small carved figures that resembled animals but with too many limbs, and a stone disc about the size of my palm, smooth and flat, with a hole in the center that had been bored with such precision that I could see perfectly through it when I held it up to the light. The base of the bridge appeared ahead, the massive limestone arch rising above me like the rib cage of something that had died so long ago that the earth had grown over its bones and forgotten it was a body. The moonlight fell through the arch in a column of silver that illuminated the creek bed below, and in that light I could see the water moving silently, without sound, as if the creek itself had been muted. The park was closed to visitors the following day, and I was joined at the station by Peter Perkins Pitchlin, a man whose title was cultural liaison, but whose actual role, as I would come to understand, was something far older and far more specific than any bureaucratic designation could contain. Peter was Choctaw, a direct descendant of one of the most prominent families in the nation's history, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had been preparing for this particular moment for most of his adult life. He arrived with a leather satchel filled with documents, maps, and hand-drawn diagrams that he spread across my desk with the methodical precision of a field researcher laying out specimens. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk with every light in the station burning and the bone-handled knife from Pushmataha's bundle lying across my lap, and I watched the wall until the sun came up and whatever had been standing outside finally moved away into the trees, its footsteps shifting halfway across the clearing from 2 to 4, the rhythm changing from the cadence of a walk to the loping, ground-covering stride of something built to run. He told me he was a member of the Choctaw Nation, one of several families who had maintained a presence in the Appalachian region for generations, long before and long after the removals. He said he had come to speak with the ranger about the trails, specifically about the section of the Cascade Trail that descended below the bridge and ran along the creek bed toward the waterfall. No, not of me, of what I had done, of the knife in the stone, of the ceremony that Nitakachi was beginning above us, his voice rising from the top of the bridge in a chant that was less singing and more geography, as if the words themselves were reshaping the landscape, pulling the walls of the gorge closer together, compressing the space between the surface and whatever lay below. The creature looked at the opening. It looked at me. And then it walked forward, shifting from 2 legs to 4 as it moved, shrinking as it descended, compressing itself into the gap in the stone the way water compresses into a crack, filling every available space until there was no space left, until the creature and the stone were indistinguishable, and the seam closed behind it with a sound like a jaw snapping shut. The chanting stopped. The bridge stopped humming. The creek, silent since I had begun my descent, resumed its murmur as if it had never stopped. I stood alone at the base of the arch with the bone knife embedded in the stone above my head and my hand bleeding where the heated handle had burned my palm. And I breathed, and I listened. And for the first time since I had arrived at Natural Bridge, the silence was not listening back. In the morning, I found Pushmataha sitting on the porch of the station, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the fog lift from the gorge with an expression that was neither triumphant nor relieved, but something closer to completion, the look of a man who has done the thing he was born to do and is now considering what comes after. The others were gathered in the clearing behind the station. Greenwood and Big LaFleur were speaking quietly by their truck. Peter and Jack Pitchlin were cleaning and repacking equipment with the efficient, silent coordination of people who have worked together so long that they no longer need to communicate with words. Mushalatubi was crouched at the edge of the tree line, examining the ground with his fingers, reading the story of the night's events and the impressions left by feet and bodies and forces that moved through the forest without leaving prints. Folsom was writing in his journal, recording every detail with the same meticulous care he had brought to every other entry in his 30 years of documentation. Nitakachi sat cross-legged on the ground near the station's rain barrel, his eyes closed, his lips moving soundlessly, as if he were having a conversation with someone I could not see. Tunkasila was wrapping the ceremonial objects back into their deerskin bundle, his movements slow and deliberate, treating each item with a reverence that made the simple act of folding cloth look like a prayer. And Apukshanubi was leaning against the south wall of the station, the wall with no windows, running his bandaged hand along the wood as if feeling for a vibration that was no longer there. I sat beside Pushmataha and accepted the cup of coffee he poured for me. "The knife is still in the stone," I said. "Yes." "Should it be removed?" He looked at me with those creek-water eyes, and this time the expression they carried was one I had not seen before. It was the expression of someone who knows something that they are not certain should be shared, not because it is secret, but because some knowledge, once given, cannot be returned. "The stone remembers what the flesh forgets," he said, for the third and final time. "Do you understand what that means now?" I thought about it. I thought about the radio transmission during my first week, the voice that came from below. I thought about the footsteps on the south side of the station. I thought about Calloway's shredded backpack and Margaret Saunders' carefully hung binoculars. I thought about the face of the Nashabatek, its human eyes filled with an emotion I recognized, an emotion that had no business being on the face of a predator. "The creature remembered being human," I said. "The stone recorded its original form, its original voice, the person it was before it became what it became. And every time it pressed itself against the limestone, it heard its own human memory played back to it, and that was why it kept coming to the bridge. Not to hunt, to remember." Pushmataha nodded slowly. And now the knife is holding that memory in place. The bone from the creature's own body, embedded in the stone that recorded its humanity. It is an anchor. As long as the knife stays in the stone, the creature stays below, listening to the thing it used to be. That is correct. I turned the coffee cup in my hands and stared into the gorge, where the fog was thinning and the first shafts of morning sunlight were striking the eastern wall of the arch, turning the limestone to gold. "But the knife is made of bone," I said, "and bone does not last forever." Pushmataha did not answer. He did not need to. The silence between us was not the listening silence of the forest or the weighted silence of the station at night. It was the silence of an answer that both of us already knew. An answer that sat between us like a stone that was too heavy to lift and too important to leave where it lay. The bone knife would decay. It might take years, it might take decades, but limestone outlasts everything, and eventually the bone would crumble and release itself from the arch, and the anchor would dissolve, and the seam in the stone would open again, and from below, from the place where 215 million years of memory pooled like groundwater in the hollow places of the earth, the thing that had once been a man and was now something older than the bridge itself would begin to climb. The official report filed with the Virginia Department of Conservation states that nothing unusual occurred at Natural Bridge State Park during the autumn of that year. The missing hikers were attributed to standard wilderness hazards. The damaged equipment was written off. The previous ranger's departure was recorded as personal leave. But if you go to the bridge today, and if you know where to look, you will find the knife. It is embedded in the stone at the base of the western arch support, about 7 feet above the waterline, in a spot where the limestone is stained with something that might be rust or might be the residue of bone that has been burning slowly against rock for years, consuming itself one molecule at a time. And if you press your ear to the stone beside it, if you hold your breath and listen with the kind of attention that requires you to forget who you are and where you are and what year it is, you will hear something, a low, continuous hum, a vibration that is not quite sound and not quite silence, but the space between the two. the frequency of a voice that has been speaking for longer than language has existed. Some people who have listened to it say it sounds like the wind moving through a cave. Others say it sounds like breathing. I know what it sounds like. It sounds like someone trying to remember their own name. I left Natural Bridge 3 days after the ceremony. Pushmataha drove me to the Amtrak station in Staunton, and we did not speak during the 40-minute drive, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and the things that remained were the kind that words cannot carry without breaking. At the station, he shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and I felt the roughness of his palm and the steadiness of his grip, and understood that this was a man who had spent his entire life holding things together that the world was trying to pull apart. "Will you go back?" he asked. "I do not know." He released my hand. "The stone will know," he said. "It always does." I boarded the train. I watched the mountains slide past the window, the ancient limestone ridges of the Shenandoah Valley rising and falling like the spine of something that had lain down to sleep a long time ago and had not yet decided whether to wake up. And I thought about the Nashoba Tek, the dog that walks like a man, pressed against the stone in the lightless spaces beneath the bridge, listening to the memory of what it used to be. And I wondered whether the thing it heard when it pressed its ear to the rock was the same thing I heard every night when I closed my eyes, and the silence gathered around me like water rising in a room with no door. The sound of a name that no one remembers. The sound of a home that no longer exists. The sound of the stone, patient and vast and without mercy, recording everything, forgetting nothing, waiting for the bone to crumble and the seal to break, and the mouth that does not close to open one final time. I still have the scar on my palm where the knife burned me. It is not faded. It is not healed. And on certain nights, when the air pressure drops and the wind comes from the south and the temperature falls to exactly 41 degrees, the scar glows. Not with light, with heat. The same heat I felt in the handle of the knife. The same heat that lives in the stone. The stone remembers what the flesh forgets. But sometimes, the flesh remembers too. And that is the part no one warned me about. There is a length of iron chain bolted into the limestone, 40 feet above Cedar Creek, and this park has no paperwork for it. I have looked. I have gone through every maintenance log back to the year the Commonwealth bought this property. Every work order, every invoice, every folder of curling photographs in the file cabinet behind the ticket desk. There is nothing, no requisition, no note in any margin. The chain is simply there. You can stand on the boardwalk under the arch on a Tuesday in June with a paper cup of coffee going cold in your hand, and tilt your head back and see it hanging off the rock face like a dead vine. 12 links, rust the color of old blood, a hook at the bottom the size of a grown man's palm. Somebody drove that anchor into solid limestone on purpose. Somebody wanted a fast way to get up off the ground. On the 9th of October, I stood on that boardwalk in the middle of the night and watched a 22-year-old man named Jack Pitchlin climb that chain with his boots gone and both hands laid open to the meat. And I watched the thing standing in the creek beneath him lift its head and open a mouth I could hear working in the wet, and call up to him in his uncle's voice. That was the moment I understood it had been listening to us for 3 days. Before we go under that arch together, I want to know where you are right now. Put your city in the comments, and put the time on your clock, the real time, the one that says whether you should be asleep. I have people who listen to me from Manila at 4 in the morning, and from Cairo at midnight, and from a truck stop outside Amarillo with the engine running, and I like knowing how far this thing travels once I let it out of my mouth. So tell me, city and local time, I will read them. Now let me set the ground under your feet, because the ground matters in this one. Natural Bridge sits in Rockbridge County, Virginia, in the western edge of the Blue Ridge, and it is the reason the county has its name. The arch is limestone, 215 feet from the water to the underside of the span, 90 feet wide at the throat. Cedar Creek carved it out over a length of time that does not fit inside a human head, and then it kept running underneath, and it is still running underneath tonight. Route 11 crosses over the top. Cars go over that arch at 55 miles an hour, and most of the drivers never know they are on a bridge at all. That has always been the thing about this place. There is a whole world under people, and they drive across the roof of it, and they never once look down. The trail runs 1.5 miles upstream from the arch to Lace Falls, following the creek the whole way on a boardwalk, and then on packed dirt, and then on wet rock. Along the way you pass the site where a saltpeter operation ran during the War of 1812. And behind that, back in the hillside, you pass a grate over a hole in the ground. That hole is Saltpeter Cave. Behind the grate the passage drops and narrows and turns and keeps going into karst that has never been fully mapped, because this whole valley is limestone, and limestone is a sponge. There are voids under these hills that no rope has ever hung in. I want you to hold on to that. It matters later. I have carried a radio and a keyring in this park for 11 years. My job on paper is trail condition, visitor contact, medical response, and interpretation, which is the official word for standing in front of school groups and telling them how water eats stone. My job in practice is walking the same 3 miles 4 times a day and noticing when something is different. That is the whole trade. Anybody can walk a trail. A ranger notices when the trail has changed its mind. I have one habit that I want on the record early, because it is going to matter more than anything else I tell you. When something happens that will need a report, I do not trust my memory. I carry a small recorder in my chest pocket, the cheap orange kind that takes 2 batteries. And I press the button and I say the date, and I say the location, and I say my name, full and clear, for the file. Then I describe what I found. Every incident, 11 years, the same 3 things first: date, location, name. Say that habit out loud to yourself once. Then keep walking with me. They came in on the 6th of October, 10 of them in 3 vehicles, and I met them at the gate at 7 in the morning, with the fog still lying in the creek bed like something spilled. The project had been in the works for 2 years. It was a mapping partnership between the park, the state, and a heritage office out of Mississippi. And the purpose of it was to trace the Eastern Road. In 1824, a Choctaw delegation traveled from their homeland to Washington City to argue about a boundary and about money that had been promised and not paid. That journey killed 2 of them. One died in Kentucky after a fall. One died in Washington in the winter and was buried there under a full military escort, which is a strange kind of honor to give a man you have been cheating. The delegation that walked that road left camps behind, and one of the accounts mentioned a stone arch over a creek in the Virginia mountains where they stopped 2 nights because the horses would not go on. The horses would not go on. That is in the account. Somebody wrote that down 200 years ago, and nobody thought about it again until this crew put it on a map. They came to find that camp. Greenwood LaFleur was running the project, 44 years old. A careful man in a canvas jacket with a pocket watch on a chain because he did not like the way a phone made him feel about time. That watch chimed on the hour. A small sound, thin, almost polite. I noticed it the first morning and thought it was charming. I want you to notice it too. His cousin came with him and everyone called him Big LaFleur, 39, 6'5", and he ran the equipment. Generator, winch, cable, come along, the whole trailer. He had a knee that had been rebuilt twice, and he walked downhill sideways like a man carrying a piano. Mushalatubby, 52, was the survey lead. Gruff, fast, no patience for anything decorative. He looked at the arch for about 9 seconds the first morning, and then looked at his tablet, and I decided I liked him. Apukshinobi was 66, and he did not talk much at all. He carried a cane knife on his belt, an old one, the blade worn thin from sharpening, and he used it to clear brush and to point at things. When he pointed at something with that knife, people looked. Folsom was 28, and he ran the drone and the mapping software. He had thermal on that drone, which is the only reason any of us are alive. Peter Perkins Pitchlynn was 35, the archivist, the one who read the old letters and did the translation work. He was careful with words the way a man is careful with a loaded rifle. He carried a field recorder that was 10 times better than mine. Jack Pitchlynn was 22, his nephew, and Jack was the one who could climb anything. He had trained bird dogs since he was 14, and he wore a silent whistle on a lanyard under his shirt, the kind that puts out a note above what a person can hear. He blew it at me the first morning as a joke, and I did not hear a thing, and he laughed, and I laughed. Nita Ketchy was 47, and Nita Ketchy counted, out loud. Steps, poles, minutes, links of chain, everything. In Choctaw, in a low, steady voice that ran under a conversation like a creek runs under a bridge. Ochifa, Tuklo, Tuchina, on and on. After one day you stopped hearing it. After 2 days you could not sleep without it. Tunkasilo was 78, and he had come as a guest of the family, not as staff. He was a Lakota speaker, and mostly blind, cataracts like frost on both eyes. And he sat where you put him, and listened to a valley the way a man reads a page. And Pushmataha was 71, and he was the reason any of it was happening. He was the elder on the project. He had a way of standing very still at the edge of a group so that people came to him instead of the other way around. 10 of them. 1 of me. 5 of us walked back out into daylight. The first day was ordinary in a way that I hold on to now, the way a man holds on to a photograph. We walked the crew up the boardwalk to the arch, and I gave them the talk I have given 4,000 times, and Mushala Tubby interrupted me twice with better questions than I had answers for. Folsom put the drone up and flew the span and came down grinning at the point cloud. Peter Perkins Pitchland stood under the throat of the arch with a photocopy of a letter in a plastic sleeve, and read a piece of it aloud, slow, in a voice that carried well in that space, and everybody stopped working to listen. The letter described a stone arch, a creek beneath it, and a night the party had spent above the water rather than beside it. Above the water rather than beside it. Peter read that line twice. Nobody had an opinion about it yet. Nita Ketchy paced the boardwalk, counting his own steps under his breath, and Big LaFleur backed the equipment trailer down the service road with about 4 inches to spare on either side, and Jack Pitchland found a way to be 40 feet up a rock face inside of 9 minutes, because Jack Pitchland always did. That was the first day. The second morning, I noticed the deer were gone. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it sounds like nothing. This park holds whitetail the way a pocket holds lint. They stand in the picnic area and stare at children. They come down to the creek at first light in groups of 6 and 8, and they are so used to people that you have to physically shoo them off the boardwalk. On the morning of the 7th of October, I walked the full 1.5 miles to Lace Falls and back, and I did not see one deer. I did not see one track in the mud at the water's edge. And the mud at the water's edge is where deer tracks live. There was, in the soft ground by the third bench, one impression that was not a deer. It was about 14 inches long, and it had 4 toes, and it had claw marks well forward of the toe pads, which means claws that do not retract, which means it is in the dog family and not the cat family. So far so ordinary. What was not ordinary was that the heel of it did not print. Not a shallow print. No print at all. That animal had been walking with its heel off the ground, up on the toes, like a dog. Fine. Except that the stride between that print and the next one was over 6 feet, and both prints were the same shape, and both of them pointed the same way, and there was no second pair anywhere. Whatever put that in the mud was walking on 2 feet, up on its toes, with a stride longer than mine, and mine is 30 inches. I took a photograph of it with my boot beside it for scale. I still have that photograph. I have never once shown it to anybody who did not already believe me. I said nothing to the crew that morning. I want that on the record too, because I have had 200 nights to think about what a different man would have done. By 11 o'clock, Apukshinobi had found the grate. Saltpeter Cave is closed to the public. It has a steel grate over the mouth of it, welded bar stock in a frame set into the rock, hinged on one side, padlocked on the other, and it is checked twice a year. That grate is built to keep people out. It is not built to keep anything in, because nobody ever thought it needed to be. The grate was bent. 2 of the bars in the middle had been pushed outward until they bowed, and the frame itself had pulled about an inch away from the rock on the hinge side. The padlock was intact. Whatever had done it had not bothered with the lock. It had simply leaned on the middle of the grate from the inside, until the metal gave up some of its opinion about where it wanted to be. Apukshinobi stood in front of it, and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he took the cane knife off his belt, and used the tip of it to lift a strand of hair off one of the bent bars. It was coarse and black and about 7 inches long, and it was not deer hair, and it was not bear hair, and every one of us standing there knew both of those things without saying either of them. Big LaFleur said, "Bear can bend a grate." Pookshanubi said, "Bear pushes with the shoulder." This got pushed with the hands. There was a pause of maybe 4 seconds. Then Mushala Tubby said we were burning daylight, and we went back to work, because that is what people do. Everybody wants the story about the moment when they realized. Nobody wants the truth, which is that the moment goes by and you pick your tablet back up and you keep working, because the alternative is to say out loud a thing that will make you sound like a fool. That afternoon Pushmataha said the sentence that I have been carrying around ever since like a stone in a coat pocket. He was sitting on the low rock ledge where the creek runs shallow over the gravel bar below the arch, with his boots off and his feet in the water, and I sat down about 6 feet from him because he had a way of making that seem like the correct thing to do. We had been talking about the 2 men who died on the 1824 road. Peter had read out the account of the burial in Washington that morning. The military escort, the minute guns, all of it, and it had put a mood on the whole crew. Pushmataha said, "Do you know why the old people washed in running water after a burial?" I said I did not. He moved his foot in the current and watched the gravel shift. He said, "Water does not keep footprints, and it does not keep names." I said that sounded like a hard kind of comfort. He said, "It is the only comfort there is. Grief follows a track. If you leave it a track, it will walk right into your house behind you. So you go through the water, and you come out the other side. And the thing that was following you gets to the bank and stops, because there is nothing there for it to read." I remember thinking it was a beautiful thing to say. I filed it away as the kind of line I would use in an interpretive talk someday, in front of a 4th-grade class, with my thumbs in my belt. I did not understand that he had just handed me the only thing that would work. Say it back once, before we go on. Water does not keep footprints, and it does not keep names. Now, before the light changes in this story, I need 30 seconds from you. The counter under this video tells me that a very large number of you are riding along with me tonight, and it also tells me that most of you have not touched the like button, have not subscribed, and have left the comment box completely empty. You have been getting the whole thing for free and giving me nothing back, which honestly is very on brand for this park, because that is exactly what the visitors do. So do it now. Like, subscribe, and drop your city and your local time down there. Do it in this next quiet minute, because once the sun goes down on the 7th of October, I am not going to stop again, and you are not going to want to take your eyes off the screen to go looking for a button. All right, come on, the light is going. The 7th of October, sunset was at 6:51. We had 2 camps. The equipment trailer and the vehicles were parked at the maintenance yard up the hill, and the working camp was on the flat ground about 200 yards upstream of the arch, 3 tents and a canopy and a folding table with the mapping gear on it. I had told them they could stay overnight because the permit allowed it, and because I had liked them all inside of a day. At 9:40, the birds stopped. That is another one of those things that sounds like nothing when you write it down. There is a night sound in these hollows. There are barred owls in this valley that scream at each other like people being murdered, and there are whippoorwills into October, and there is always the noise of small things moving in leaf litter. At 9:40 on the 7th, all of it quit at once, the way a room quits when someone opens the door and everyone turns to see who it is. Tunkasela lifted his head first. He was sitting in a camp chair by the fire with his hands on his knees, and those frosted eyes were pointed at nothing at all, and he raised his chin about 2 inches, like a man in a church catching the first note of a hymn. He said, "Somebody is on the hill." Big LaFleur said, "Ranger, you got hikers?" I said the trail closed at dusk, and the gate at the top was locked. I said it in the flat voice I use when I am telling the truth, and I already do not believe it. Nitakechi had been counting the guy lines on the canopy when the sound stopped, and he had gotten to 7, and he did not finish. He just stood there with his mouth partway open, holding a number. Then we heard it walk. It came along the slope above the camp, left to right, unhurried, about 80 yards out and maybe 30 feet up. 2 feet. I want to be very precise, because Everything after this depends on it. A four-legged animal on a hillside makes a rhythm of four, and the rhythm rolls. A two-legged animal makes a rhythm of two, and it punches. This punched, step, 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 slow, heavy, leaves compressing and letting go under something that weighed a great deal more than a man. Greenwood LaFleur stood up out of his chair with his hand flat on the table, and his pocket watch chimed the hour. 10 o'clock. That thin, polite little sound, out there in all that silence. The walking stopped. Nobody in that camp moved for about 12 seconds. I counted them later off the recorder, because I had already put my hand in my chest pocket and pressed the button without deciding to, which is a thing 11 years builds into a man. Then the walking started again, going back the other way, right to left, faster now, and I heard it climb, and I heard it get up onto the bench of the ridge, and then I heard nothing at all for a very long time. Peter Perkins Pitchlynn said, quietly, "It came back for the sound." Mushulatubby said, "It is a bear." Peter said, "It walked away when it was walking away. Then a small noise happened and it turned around and came back. Bears do not do that. Bears leave." Big LaFleur said, "So what is that?" Peter did not answer him. He looked at the fire. Pushmataha answered instead, and this was the first piece of the two-layer way he talked, where the words on top were about one thing and the words underneath were about something else entirely. He said, "Anything gets curious about a sound it has not heard before. A raccoon will do that. What you want to watch for is the one that comes back a second time to hear it again." Greenwood put his hand over his watch. That night I slept 4 hours in the bed of my truck at the maintenance yard, with the windows up, which is not something I had done in 11 years of working in this park. The 8th of October is the day everything stopped being a story about strange noises and became something with a shape. Folsom put the drone up at 7:15 in the morning with the thermal payload on it, because the air was cold and the ground was cold, and that is when heat shows up like a lamp in a cellar. He flew a grid over the slope where we had heard the walking. He found nothing on the bench. He widened it, and he took it over the old saltpeter works and the hillside above the cave mouth. And about 4 minutes into that pass, he said a word I will not repeat and set the drone into a hover. We crowded the tablet. On the thermal there was a hillside in shades of cold, and there was one bright spot, and the bright spot was in a fold of ground under a rock overhang about 110 yards above and behind the cave grate. It was not the shape of a deer lying down. A deer lying down makes a bean. This made a long shape, about 7.5 feet from end to end, and the hot part of it was concentrated at one end. And while we watched, the long shape got shorter, because it sat up. Folsom took the drone up 30 feet. The shape stood. It stood the way a person stands who has been kneeling a long time, in stages. It went from lying, to sitting, to a crouch, to full height. And at full height the thermal blob was 8 feet if it was an inch, and the proportions were wrong in the specific way that has kept me awake for 2 years. The arms came down past where the knee should be. The legs bent backward at the middle joint, the way a dog's back legs bend, and it stood on the front part of its feet, high, like a sprinter frozen in the blocks. And then it turned its head straight up at the drone. Folsom said, "It hears the props." Peter Perkins Pitchlynn said, "Bring it home. Bring it home now. Do not fly it back over the camp. Take it up the creek and bring it around." Folsom, to his enormous credit, did exactly that, and I have wondered ever since whether that decision bought us the whole first night. At noon we found the tree. It was a big double-trunked chestnut oak, about 60 yards off the trail on the uphill side, and there were 3 whitetail carcasses wedged in the fork of it, 11 feet off the ground, not dropped there, wedged, jammed down into the crotch of the tree so they would not fall, the way a person stores something they intend to come back for. The hindquarters had been taken off 2 of them. The third was whole and fresh enough that it had not gone stiff yet. Mushulatubby, the survey lead, the man with no patience for anything decorative, stood and looked up at that tree for a full minute. Then he said, "How does it get them up there?" Nobody answered. He said, "No. Listen to me. That is a 140-pound animal at 11 feet with no branches under it. How does it get them up there?" A Pukshanubi said, "It carries them up." Mushulatubby said. With what? Apukshaanubi said, with one arm. We went back to camp and I tried to call it in. The repeater for this park sits on the hill above the maintenance yard, in a green cabinet with a whip antenna. And it is the only reason a handheld radio works down in this creek bed at all. Because we are in a slot of rock, and a radio in a slot of rock is a paperweight. I could not raise dispatch. I walked up the hill to the cabinet and the door of the cabinet was open, and the coax jumper between the duplexer and the antenna feed had been pulled out of its connector and was lying on the gravel. Pulled out. Not chewed. The connector was undamaged. Somebody had turned it, counterclockwise, 4 full turns, and lifted it free. I stood on that hill with that cable in my hand for a long time. Then I went and got the satellite messenger out of the truck, and I sent the short code for non-emergency assistance, and it sent, and I felt better for about 9 hours. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Peter Perkins Pitchlynn played us a recording, and that was the end of anybody arguing about bears. He had left his field recorder running on the folding table all through the previous night, because he had wanted the ambient sound of the site for the project. He had gone through it that afternoon on headphones at 4 times speed, looking for the walking. He found the walking. He also found something at 2:19 in the morning that he did not go looking for. He put it on the little speaker and turned the volume up, and we all leaned in. There was creek noise. There was a long stretch of nothing. And then, from somewhere off to the left of the microphone, maybe 40 yards out, a voice said, Achafa, Tuklo, Tuchina. 1, 2, 3, in Choctaw, in a low, steady voice, running under the creek sound. Nitakechi went the color of wet paper, because it was his voice. Not an imitation of his voice the way a person does an impression. It was his voice, the grain of it, the little catch he has on the second syllable. And it was coming from 40 yards outside a camp where Nitakechi had been asleep in a tent with 2 other men who could swear to it. And then the voice on the recording said, Tuchina, Tuchina, Tuklo, Achafa, Achafa, Achafa. 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 1. It had the sounds. It did not have the order. It was practicing. Nitakechi did not count out loud again for the rest of his life. And I have thought about that more than I want to. Greenwood LaFleur made the call to pull out at first light. Not that night, first light. And I have gone over that decision from every angle a man can find, and here is the truth of it. It was the right call, with the information we had, because moving 11 people a mile and a half down a wet trail in the black with something on the ridge is how you lose people. And staying in one lit place with a fire and 9 sets of eyes is how you keep them. It was the right call. We packed the working camp down to nothing but the tents and the light. At 7:40, Folsom realized the drone case with both spare batteries and the storage cards was still sitting under the folding table at the old survey point, 400 yards upstream, and every piece of evidence any of us had was on those cards. Jack Pitchlynn said he would get it. He said it before anybody could get in front of it. He was 22 years old, and he had been listening to grown men talk about a monster all day. And there is a thing that happens in a young man's chest at that age that is not bravery and is not stupidity and does not have a good name. I said I would go with him. Peter said we would both go. Jack was already 40 yards up the trail with a headlamp, and he called back, It is 400 yards, Uncle. I will be back before you get your boots on. He was right about the 400 yards. We heard him get there. We saw the headlamp turn around. We watched that little cone of light start coming back down the creek toward us, bobbing, moving fast. And I remember Big LaFleur laughing about something. And I remember thinking that we were going to be fine. Then the headlamp stopped. Then it went sideways, hard, and swung up and hit the underside of the leaves. And Jack Pitchlynn started screaming. And the sound that answered him was not a growl and was not a roar. It was a long, wet, rising bark. And it broke in the middle, the way a dog's bark breaks when the dog is too big for its own throat. And it came off the rock walls of that gorge and hit us from 4 directions at once. We ran up the trail, all 9 of us, in the black, on wet boardwalk. We found his headlamp in the water. We found 1 boot. We found a smear on the planks that I have never described to his family, and never will. And 40 feet above us, On the face of the arch, we heard iron move. He had gotten to the chain. God knows how. Somewhere between the water and the wall, he had gotten his hands on 12 links of rusted iron that nobody in 100 years has been able to explain. And he had climbed it, and he was up there in the black holding on with 2 hands that had been opened to the meat. And he was crying, and he was saying, "It is under me, it is under me, it is right under me." I put my light down into the creek. It was standing in 18 inches of water with its back to us. 8 feet. Wet black hair lying flat in ridges over a back that was too narrow at the waist and too wide at the shoulder. Digitigrade legs. Arms down past the knee. And when it turned its head to look back over that shoulder at my light, the head was long and low and the muzzle came out of the face like the front of a shovel, and the eyes threw my beam back at me in a flat gold green that no person and no bear has ever had. It looked at me for 2 seconds. It was not afraid of the light, it was reading it. Then it lifted its head toward the boy on the chain, and it opened that mouth, and out of it came Peter Perkins Pitchlin's voice. Exact, careful, gentle. The voice of a man who is careful with words the way a man is careful with a loaded rifle. It said, "Jack, let go, I have you." And I heard Peter, the real Peter, standing 6 feet from me, make a sound I have never heard a human being make before or since. And 40 feet up in the black, my light found Jack Pitchlin's face, and he was looking down, and he was 22 years old, and he had been holding on for a very long time, and he had heard his uncle's voice say that it had him. He let go. Here is a thing nobody tells you about a 40-foot fall. It is not loud. There is no crash. There is a sound like a wet coat dropped onto a porch, and then there is the creek, going on exactly the way it was going on before, because a creek has no opinion about any of it. Jack Pitchlin hit the gravel bar at the edge of the water, and he was gone before the sound finished, and I mean gone in both ways. My light was on him for less than a second and a half. Something came into the frame from the left moving faster than anything that size has any business moving, and it took him off the gravel with one hand hooked under his belt, and it went up the far bank into the rhododendron without ever going onto 4 legs. Uphill, carrying 170 pounds, upright. That is the part Musha Latubby had asked about at the tree, and now we had the answer, and none of us wanted it. Peter Perkins Pitchlin tried to go into the water after him, and Big LaFleur caught him around the chest and carried him backward down the boardwalk like a man carrying a rolled carpet. And Peter was screaming his nephew's name over and over, and I put my hand on his mouth. I am not proud of it. I put my hand over a grown man's mouth in the worst minute of his life, and I said, into his ear, "Do not give it your voice. It is collecting." He stopped. He stopped instantly, because he was the one man there who understood exactly what I meant, and because a part of him had already worked it out on the recording that afternoon. We got back to the fire. We got everybody inside the ring of light, and we built that fire up until it was a stupid, wasteful, beautiful thing, and we sat with our backs to it and watched the black in every direction, and nobody said one single word for the rest of the night. At 4 in the morning it started calling. It called from the ridge, and it called from the creek, and once it called from behind the tents, close enough that I could hear the breath under the words. It called in Jack's voice. It said, "Uncle, Uncle, please." It said it 11 times, and each time it was a little better than the time before, and the 11th time it had the crack in it, the exact crack a young man's voice gets when he is crying. And Peter Perkins Pitchlin sat by that fire with both fists against his teeth and did not answer. Pushmataha put his hand on the back of Peter's neck and held it there, and he said, very quietly, "It does not know what it is saying. It knows what it is worth. That is the second thing I want you to carry with you." It did not understand the words. It understood the price of them. First light came at 7:11, and it came gray and thin, and it was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. We went and looked. Of course we went and looked. 10 men, gray-faced in daylight, walking a creek bed with tent poles and a cane knife and one very inadequate pistol, because you do not leave a 22-year-old boy in the woods, not for anything, not ever. We found the drag line up the far bank, rhododendron laid over in a channel, broken at the height of my shoulder, and a smear on the leaves that went 140 yards uphill in a straight line, straight the way a man walks home in the rain. It ran to the old saltpeter bench, and it ran to the mouth of Saltpeter Cave, and it went in under the bent bars of that grate, and it stopped. Mushulatubby said the word we had all been avoiding for 2 days. He said, "Den." We went up to the maintenance yard to get the vehicles, and the access road was blocked. There is a beach about 18 inches through the trunk that stood on the inside of the second curve, and it was lying across the road. That happens. Trees fall. What does not happen is that the trunk was cut through at 47 inches off the ground, and I measured it, and the cut face was not a chainsaw cut, and was not a beaver cut, and was not a break. It was crushed and torn in a rough band about 9 inches wide, and there were 4 parallel gouges in the standing stump, deep, spaced about 2.5 inches apart. It had leaned on that tree with its hands until the tree came apart, and it had done it at chest height, which is the height a thing works at when it is standing up. Big LaFleur looked at that stump for a long time, and then he said, "It closed the door." Folsom said, "Animals do not close doors." Tunkasila, who had been standing at the edge of the road with one hand on Nitakechi's elbow and those frosted eyes pointed at the sky, said the first long thing he had said since he arrived. He said, "You keep calling it an animal because that is the smaller of the 2 things it could be." Folsom said, "What is the bigger one?" And Tunkasila said, "Something that used to be an animal, and then it stood up, and then it started wanting what standing up things want." Nobody had a reply to that. Then Tunkasila said the thing that saved 5 lives, and he said it in the flat, bored voice of an old man explaining something obvious to people who should have worked it out already. He said, "It does not track you by smell. If it tracked you by smell, it would have come into that camp last night because you smelled like meat and smoke and fear from a mile off, and it stood 40 feet away and did nothing but talk. It talks because talking is the trap. It has learned that if it makes the right sound, the food answers, and then the food is standing up and moving and telling it exactly where the food is. It does not hunt you. It calls you, and you come." There was a long pause. Pushmataha said, "Then nobody answers anything, from this minute. Not a shout, not a name, not a whistle. If you hear one of us calling you, you assume it is not one of us." Greenwood LaFleur said, "And if it actually is one of us," Pushmataha said, "then we have already lost him. Here is what we decided, and I have laid it out in front of 2 review boards and a very quiet room full of state investigators, and I will lay it out for you the same way. The satellite messenger had sent. Help was coming, but non-emergency help, over a mountain, on a Sunday, up a road with a beach across it. Call it 4 hours minimum, call it 8 realistically. We had 10 men, 2 of them over 70, one of them nearly blind, and one of them, Peter, who I honestly did not believe could walk. We had 1.5 miles of trail between us and the front gate, and every foot of it ran along the bottom of a rock slot with a 100-foot wall on one side. And we had a den, with a boy in it, 400 yards uphill. Big LaFleur had the equipment trailer, and in that trailer was a cable come along rated at 4,000 pounds, 60 feet of half-inch steel cable, and a set of grip hooks. His idea was simple, and it was the idea of a man who has spent his life making heavy things go where he wants them to go. Run the cable through the grate and around the rock buttress at the cave mouth, and crank the bent bars back flat, and lock the whole thing shut with the cable itself. Close the door on it. Mushulatubby said that only worked if it was inside. Big LaFleur said, "It fed last night. It is inside." Apukshanubi said, "And so is the boy." That is how 10 men came to be standing in front of a hole in the ground at 9:40 in the morning on the 9th of October. We rigged it in about 50 minutes. Big LaFleur and Folsom ran the cable. Mushulatubby and Greenwood set the anchor. I stood at the mouth with the pistol I did not believe in, and Nitakechi stood beside me holding a 5-cell flashlight, and neither of us said anything at all, because Nitakechi had stopped talking on the 7th, and I had run out of useful words on the 8th. And Apukshanubi, 66 years old, walked past all of us and took the padlock off with the master key and pulled the grate open and went inside. Nobody stopped him. I want you to understand that we tried, for about 4 seconds, in the low, urgent voices of people who cannot shout. And he looked back at us from inside the mouth of that cave, with the cane knife in his hand, and he said, "You do not leave a boy in the ground. If I am not back before the light on my helmet turns yellow, you shut it." Peter Perkins Pitchlynn went in behind him, then Mushula Tubby, then me. The rest of them stayed on the cable, and I have never in my life been so glad about an argument I lost. The passage past the grate drops about 12 feet on breakdown blocks, and then flattens into a room the size of a two-car garage, with a ceiling you can stand up in if you are not tall. The saltpeter men worked that room in 1812. You can still see where they cut into the floor sediment, and there are 2 hewn beams from a leaching vat lying against the wall. And there is a name scratched into the flowstone with a date under it from a war nobody in that room was thinking about. The room stank. Not the sweet rot of a dead deer, something under that. Wet copper and ammonia and old fat. And it hit us at the bottom of the drop like walking into a wall of it, and Mushula Tubby gagged and put his sleeve over his face and kept going. Past the room, the passage narrows to a slot you go through sideways, maybe 30 feet of it, and then it opens again. And the second room was where it kept things. Bones, first. The whole floor of it was bones. Deer, mostly, in a layer about knee-deep at the back wall, gnawed at the joint ends, some of them old enough to be crumbling, and some of them still wet. A black bear skull with the top of the brain case caved in like an eggshell. And in among all that, the other things. A hiking boot, brown, size 11, laces still tied. A rolled-up sleeping pad. A Green Ranger issue handheld radio, the old model, the one this park stopped carrying in 1999, with the battery pack corroded into a solid white block. I picked that radio up. I have to tell you that I picked it up and turned it over and read the property number scratched on the back of it, and I know the man that number belonged to because his photograph is on the wall in the office under a small brass plate, and the plate says he was lost on the mountain in 1998 and never found. 26 years. It had been here 26 years, and every one of those years the park had run school groups down that boardwalk, and I had stood at the bottom of it 4 times a day with my thumbs in my belt telling children how water eats stone. And then Peter Perkins Pitchlynn made a sound at the back of the room, and I turned my light, and he was on his knees in the bones holding a lanyard with a small nickel-plated whistle on it. A silent whistle, the kind that puts out a note above what a person can hear. Jack's jacket was under it. It was folded, not dropped. Folded, sleeves in, the way you fold a thing you are keeping. Peter said. It folded it. And from somewhere in the black past the back wall of that room, from a passage none of us had seen yet, something answered him in a young man's voice. It said, "It folded it." There is a specific kind of quiet that 4 grown men make in a cave when a voice comes out of a hole that should not have anything in it. Apukshaanubi moved first, and he moved backward, and he moved us backward with him, one hand flat on Mushula Tubby's chest, walking us toward the slot without ever turning his back on the black at the rear of that room. Peter would not stand up. He was on his knees in the bones with his nephew's folded jacket against his face, and he had made a decision somewhere in the last 4 seconds, and it was not a decision any of us were going to allow. I got him under the arms. Mushula Tubby got his belt. We dragged him 9 feet and he fought us the whole way. And then he stopped fighting all at once, and I felt the exact second the fight left him, and I have felt worse things since, but not many. Apukshaanubi put us into the slot in the order of who could move fastest. Mushula Tubby first, then Peter, then me. He stayed at the mouth of it with the cane knife low against his thigh. I said his name. Once, low, at the entrance to that slot. And it is the only time in 3 days I broke the rule about names. He said, "Go on, Ranger. 30 feet is not enough room for it to stand up. Something that big is only big where there is room. 2 layers, that one." On top it was tactics. Underneath it was a man telling me he had already done the arithmetic on the rest of his life and found it acceptable. I went into the slot sideways with my chest against the rock and my light on Peter's back, and behind me I heard the room change. I heard something come out of the back passage, and it did not scramble, and it did not rush. It walked. In a room with a 9-foot ceiling, it walked. and I heard the top of its skull scrape flowstone, and I heard it breathe, and the breath had a rattle in it like a chain being pulled through a pipe. I heard Apukshanabi say something in Choctaw. 4 or 5 words, calm, conversational, the tone of a man greeting a neighbor over a fence. I heard the cane knife hit, twice. Then I heard the sound of a 66-year-old man being taken off his feet, and then I did not hear him again. The 3 of us came up the breakdown and out through the grate into daylight, and Big LaFleur already had the come-along under tension, and Greenwood LaFleur was counting heads with his hand still on the crank, and he got to 3, and he looked past us into that hole, and his face did something I will not try to describe. Folsom said, "Where is he?" Mushalatubby said, "Shut it." Big LaFleur threw his whole weight on that ratchet handle, and the cable came up singing, and the bent bars started to come back true, and the grate swung and slammed into its frame, and he got 2 full strokes on the ratchet, 3, 4, and the cable went hard as a bar. And then something hit the inside of that grate. The whole hillside jumped. That is not a figure of speech. Dust came off the rock face above the cave mouth, and a stone the size of a dinner plate came loose and rolled down the bench, and everybody went off their feet except Big LaFleur, who had both hands on the handle. It hit it again. The frame moved a 1/4 inch out of the rock. Big LaFleur looked back over his shoulder at his cousin, and he said, "Take them down. I have got this door." Greenwood LaFleur said, "Get on the cable with me." And Big LaFleur said the thing that I hear in the middle of the night more often than the screaming. He said, "Cousin, one of us has to be the one who holds it, and you have got a wife." We went down the bench in a line with 2 old men in the middle of it. Behind us I heard the grate go, and it did not go with a crash. It went with a long, slow, tearing complaint, metal giving up an inch at a time, and under that I heard Big LaFleur, 39 years old, 6'5", with a knee that had been rebuilt twice, laughing at it. He was laughing at it. He wanted its attention on him, and he knew exactly one way to get it. He bought us about 90 seconds. Then we were on the trail, and the trail was 1.5 miles long, and we were 7. Here is the geometry of that run, because the geometry is the whole story. Cedar Creek Trail runs downstream in the bottom of a gorge. On the left, going out, is a rock wall you cannot climb. On the right is the creek, and past the creek is a slope of rhododendron and breakdown that a person cannot move through, and that a thing with hands can move through at speed. So it was above us, and to the right the entire way, and it never once got in front of us, and it never once tried to. It did not need to. It had all the time in the world, and it had our voices. It started calling before we made the first bend. It called in Apukshanabi's voice, and it said, "Ranger, Ranger, I am at the water." It called in Big LaFleur's voice, and it said, "Cousin, cousin, my leg." Greenwood LaFleur made one small sound at that, and Pushmataha caught his sleeve and did not let go of it for 400 yards. Nobody answered. 7 people walking fast down a wet boardwalk in the middle of the morning in a state park in Virginia, and something on the slope above us was working through the roster of the dead, and nobody answered. And at 11 o'clock, a pocket watch chimed. That thin, polite, well-made little sound, in a canvas jacket, on a chain, on a careful man who did not like the way a phone made him feel about time. The slope above us went quiet, and then it came down toward the creek fast, and Greenwood LaFleur had the watch out of his pocket and off the chain before any of us understood what he was doing. He said, "It follows the sound." Pushmataha said, "Greenwood." Greenwood LaFleur said, "It is 11 o'clock. It has 59 minutes of me." And then he was gone off the boardwalk and into the water and across it and up the far bank, going upstream, uphill, away from us, with a chiming watch in his fist. And he was 44 years old, and he ran like a man who had already worked out that a straight line is worth more than a good chance. We heard the watch for a long way. Then the watch stopped. Nitakechi went at the second bench, and Nitakechi went because it finally found the one voice it had been saving. It called with his own. Ashafa, Tuklo, Tuchina. In the low, steady voice with the little catch on the second syllable, the voice he had not used since the 7th of October, running under the creek sound exactly the way it always had. And I watched a 47-year-old man who had done everything right for 2 days turn his head toward the slope. And I watched his mouth open, and I do not think he was answering it. I think he was correcting it. I think it had the order wrong again, and some part of him could not stand it. He got out one syllable. The rhododendron came apart, and he was off the boardwalk and into the leaves, and there was no scream at all. And that is the part that Folsom still cannot talk about, that there was no scream, that a man can be removed from the middle of a group of people in complete silence in broad daylight. 6 of us. Then 5, 90 seconds later, and the 5th one was on purpose. Tunkasila stopped walking. He put his hand on the rail of the boardwalk, and he turned around, and he faced back up the trail with those frosted eyes pointed at nothing, and he said, in the calm voice of a man who has been waiting a long time for a bus he already knew was coming, "It is going to keep taking one at a time until you are gone. It only follows one voice." Pushmataha said, "Do not." Tunkasila said, "Old friend, I am 78 years old. I cannot see this trail, and I am the slowest thing in this valley. You have carried me for 2 days. Let me put something down." And then he took a breath, and he called out, loud in Lakota, up into that gorge. He called it. He gave it a name and an invitation. And the whole slope above us turned around and came for him. And he stood at the rail with his hand out flat and did not move 1 inch. 5 of us went around the bend at a dead run. 400 yards from the arch, at the wide gravel bar where the creek comes out of the rock slot and slows down, it got in front of us. I do not know how. I have walked that ground 1,000 times since, and I cannot make it work. It came out of the water on the downstream side, 60 yards ahead, and it stood up in the middle of the trail between 5 people, and the only way out of that gorge. In full daylight. I had seen it in a flashlight beam, and I had seen it as a smear of heat on a tablet. In daylight it was worse, because in daylight it was ordinary. Wet black hair, a long low head, 2 gold-green eyes set forward the way a hunter's eyes are set forward, arms hanging down past the knee with hands on the end of them, actual hands, with 4 long fingers and a thumb that worked, and mud under the nails. It was breathing hard. It had been working all morning. And it looked at the 5 of us, and it opened its mouth, and it started going through everything it had, one after another, fast, like a man going through keys on a ring. "Uncle, cousin, ranger, Ashafa, Tuklo, my leg, uncle, please, I have you." Mushalatubby went down on one knee with a hand on his side where a rock had opened him at the cave mouth, and I did not even know he was hurt until that second. And Peter Perkins Pitchlin, the archivist, the man who was careful with words the way a man is careful with a loaded rifle, said, out of nowhere, in a perfectly flat voice, "I mistranslated it." Folsom said, "What?" Peter said, "The letter, the camp. I read it as above the water. It is not above. The word is inside. They did not camp above the water. They stood in it, all night, 2 nights. That is why the horses would not go on, and that is why nobody died at this arch in 1824. And I heard, in my own head, in an old man's voice, from a rock ledge in the sunshine 2 days and 100 years ago, 'Water does not keep footprints, and it does not keep names.' I said it out loud. I said it exactly the way he had said it to me, and Pushmataha turned and looked at me, and the look on his face was the look of a man watching a debt get paid. I said, 'Everybody into the creek, middle of the channel. Nobody says one word from here to the arch.' We went off that boardwalk into 30 inches of cold water, and we walked down the middle of Cedar Creek, 5 people in a line, and the thing on the gravel bar came to the edge of the water and stopped. It could have come in. That is what I need you to understand. It was not afraid of water. I had watched it stand in that creek at midnight with a boy on a chain above it. It stopped because we had gone quiet, and because the creek was loud, and because we were standing inside the one sound in that entire gorge that erases everything you put into it. There were no footprints in the water. There were no names in the water. Everything it knew how to do with us, all 3 days of collecting, every voice it had taken off a dying man, all of it was aimed at a bank we were no longer standing on. It walked us down, a mile of it, 60 yards out on the right-hand slope, pacing us, in daylight, calling. It called in Jack's voice, and it called in Greenwood's, and it called in Tunkasila's, and near the end, and I am sorry, but near the end it called in Nita Ketchi's, and it finally had the counting in the right order. And 5 people stood in cold water in the middle of a creek in Rockbridge County, Virginia, and listened to their dead friends beg, and not one of us opened our mouth. We came out from under the arch at 11:51 in the morning. There were 2 deputies and a parked truck in the picnic area, because the beach across the road had turned into somebody else's problem an hour before, and I remember a young deputy looking at 5 soaked men walking out of a creek and saying, "Sir, are you injured?" And I remember thinking that it was the stupidest and kindest question I had ever heard. That is the whole account. Everything after it is paperwork. They ran the cave for 11 days with a team out of Roanoke. They recovered enough to hold 4 funerals, and not enough to hold 2. The bones in that second room went to a lab, and the lab returned a report that said the material was consistent with black bear and white-tailed deer, and that 4 samples were degraded beyond typing. And if you would like to know what a state agency does with the phrase degraded beyond typing, the answer is that they put it in a folder. The 1998 radio went into an evidence bag. The photograph is still on the wall in the office under the small brass plate. The plate has not been changed, and I do not expect it to be. Officially, 6 people were lost in a cave incident involving an unidentified large predator. The families asked that the names be withheld from the public file. I understand why they asked. It is a mercy, and it is also the exact shape of what Pushmataha told me on that rock ledge in the sunshine, and I have never once been able to decide whether it is a mercy at all. Water does not keep footprints, and it does not keep names. Now here is the part I have not put in any report, and here is why I have told you all of this tonight, instead of going to bed. My recorder never came out of that cave. The small orange one, the cheap one that takes 2 batteries. It was in my chest pocket when Apukchanubi put his hand flat on Mushalatubi's chest and started walking us backward, and it was not in my chest pocket when I came up out of the grate into the daylight, and the recovery team never found it, and they had 11 days and good lights. There were 4 incident logs on it: the bent grate, the tree with the deer in it, the thermal contact, the night of the 9th. And every single one of them starts the same way, because 11 years builds a thing into a man, and I said it out loud into that little plastic microphone 4 separate times in 3 days, clear and slow, for the file. The date, the location, and my name. On the 19th of April, at 3:40 in the morning, I was standing on the boardwalk under the arch with a flashlight, doing a check I did not need to do, on a night I could not sleep. The creek was running. Route 11 was empty overhead. 12 links of rusted iron hung 40 feet up the rock face with a hook on the end of it the size of a grown man's palm. And from somewhere upstream, from the black slot where the water comes out of the rock, something started counting in Choctaw, in a low, steady voice, in the right order. And when it got to 10, it stopped. And then it said my name. Water does not keep footprints, and it does not keep names. That is what the old man told me, and I believed him. And I walked out of that gorge because I believed him. But there is one thing in this valley that keeps everything, and it has been keeping it since 1812, and it is a hole in the ground with a bent grate over it, and it has my voice on a cheap orange recorder saying who I am. So I am going to ask you for one thing before you go, and then I am going to leave you alone. Tell me in the comments what you would have done at the second bench when it called in Nitakechi's voice with the numbers in the wrong order, and every part of you wanted to correct it. Be honest. And if you are out walking tonight, anywhere, in any country, and you hear somebody you love calling to you from off the trail, do not answer them. Get in the water. The first thing the families always ask me is whether their people suffered. I have learned to lie about that. The truth is that I do not know, because in all my years in these mountains, in the one valley I am about to tell you about, we have never once recovered a single one of them to ask. I am a backcountry ranger in the high wilderness of West Virginia, in the Appalachians, in some of the most remote country left in the eastern United States. For 60 years, hikers have walked into one particular valley in my district and not come out. The official record blames the terrain, falls, exposure, the river. The official record is a lie, and an old man left me a box that proves it. There is something in that valley that you smell before you ever hear it, and hear before you ever see it, and by the time you see it, the old files say, it is already too late. This is the account of the night I went in to find out if a dying man had been telling the truth. He was. I wish to every part of me that he had not been. Take a breath. We will get to all of it. But first, welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first night here, settle in and pull the blanket close, because you have chosen a dark one to begin with. Before we walk down into that valley, do 3 small things for me. Tap that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so the next time the woods go wrong, you are right here beside me when it happens. Leave a like, because that is the one simple thing that carries these stories to the people who cannot sleep without them. And down in the comments, tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what the time is where you sit. I want to know how far this story is going to travel, and how many of you are out there in the dark with me right now. Because somewhere near you, in your own corner of the world, there is a stretch of country the locals do not walk into after dark. Maybe you already know the place. Maybe by the end of tonight, you will understand exactly why they stay out of it. So, turn the lights down, put your headphones on, lock your door if it helps you feel safer. It will not help, but go on and do it. And please, stay until the very end, because the part that still keeps me awake, the part I never put in any report, is waiting for you there. You and I both know you are about to scroll past the like button again. Do not press it first, then come down with me. Let us begin. The first thing you need to understand is how empty the high country of West Virginia truly is. People hear Appalachia, and they picture gentle hills and little towns tucked in the hollows. There is plenty of that. But up on the high plateau where I work, there is a wilderness so large and so rough that a person can walk for 3 days and not cross a road, not see a power line, not hear a single engine. Red spruce so thick it makes a green dark at noon. Open bogs the old-timers call glades, soft wet ground that will take your boot to the knee. Rhododendron grown into walls. 2 cold rivers, the kind that drowned more loggers than the falling timber ever did, back when there was logging up there at all. It is some of the most remote country left in the eastern half of this nation, and I have given my life to it, and I love it, and I am afraid of one valley in it, in a way that I cannot fully put into words. My name is Wyatt. I have worked backcountry patrol in this wilderness for the better part of 2 decades. I grew up at the foot of the plateau, in a town that the coal left and the timber left and the young people left after them. My grandfather cut spruce up on that mountain before it was set aside as wilderness, back when a narrow-gauge railroad still ran the logs out. And he used to take me up the old grades as a boy and show me where the rails had been pulled up and the forest had swallowed everything but the cuts. He taught me that the mountain gives and the mountain takes, and that a wise man respects both. When my own life down in the valley fell apart, the details of which I will keep, I came up here and took the ranger work, and the high country took me back in the way it always had. The work is solitary and hard, and I have never wanted any other. I do the things you would expect. I patrol the trails, what trails there are. I clear blowdown. I check the trail registers at the wilderness boundaries where backpackers sign in and sign out. I pack out the garbage that people leave at the popular spots, and I run search and rescue when somebody does not come home. Over the years I have carried out more people than I like to count. Most of them were the plain sad kind. A turned ankle that became a cold night that became a body. A swimmer who misjudged the river. A heart that stopped on a hard climb. I made my peace with that kind of loss a long time ago. It is the price of letting people love a dangerous place. But there was always the valley. In my district there is a long drainage that runs down off the highest part of the plateau, where one of the rivers cuts a deep cleft between 2 ridges before it opens out into the glades below. It is beautiful, in the way the most dangerous places are always beautiful. And in the 19 years I worked there, and in the years before me, and the years before that, people went into that valley and did not come out, at a rate that no one in any official capacity has ever been willing to look at squarely. Not a fall here and a drowning there, spread across the whole wilderness the way you would expect. A pattern, one drainage, the same long valley. Hikers, mostly solo, sometimes pairs, walking in healthy and prepared and experienced, and simply ceasing to exist somewhere along that river. And here is the part that I could never make sit right, long before any of the rest of it. We almost never found them. In ordinary terrain, even bad terrain, you find people, you find a body, or you find sign, a dropped pack, a torn jacket on a snag, bones in the spring after the snow goes. The mountain gives them back. That valley did not give them back. They went in, and the ground closed over them like water, and the next season there would be another one, and the families would come up and stand at the trailhead and ask me if their person had suffered, and I would lie, because the truth, that I had no idea, that I had nothing, not a boot, not a bone, was somehow worse. I want to introduce you to the man who is the reason I know what I know. His name was Errol Sayre. Errol had been the backcountry ranger in that district for 30 years before me. He had hired me, in a sense, recommended me for the work when he retired, and we had stayed in touch, the way men in a lonely profession do. By the time this story takes place, he was past 70 and dying, slowly, of a lung disease that the timber dust and the wood smoke of a long life had given him. And he lived alone in a small house at the edge of town with an oxygen line in his nose and a worn brass compass that he turned over and over in his fingers when he talked. An old habit, something to do with his hands. Errol Sayre was the most respected woodsman I ever knew. He did not drink, he did not exaggerate, and in 30 years he had never once told me a tale that did not check out. His one goal, in the time he had left, as far as I could tell, was to get someone to finally believe him before he died, and to not take what he knew into the ground. It was the middle of November when a backpacker went missing in the valley. His name was Shane Coburn, a fit, experienced man in his late 30s from over in Virginia, who had come to do a 4-day solo loop down the drainage and back up over the far ridge. He signed the register on a Saturday. He was due out Tuesday. His truck sat alone in the lot at the high trailhead through Wednesday, and his sister called the state, and it came to me, and I felt the old cold weight settle into my stomach the moment I saw which drainage his route ran, because I had felt it before, and I knew already, in the part of me that the job had taught, that we were not going to find Shane Coburn. That evening, before I went in, I drove out to see Errol Sayre. I do not fully know why. I think I wanted the old man to tell me I was being a fool, the way you want an elder to make a fear smaller. He did the opposite. He was in his chair by the window with the oxygen hissing softly, turning that brass compass over in his hands. And when I told him a solo hiker was overdue in the valley, his face changed in a way I had never seen on him, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Wyatt, go get the box out of my hall closet, the wooden one. Bring it here." I did. It was an old ammunition crate, heavy, and when he opened it I saw it was full of paper, files, decades of files, yellowed incident reports, some of them in his own hand, some in the hands of rangers before him going back further than I knew the records went, newspaper clippings, brittle and brown, folded careful, hand-drawn maps of the valley with marks on them. He had been keeping it, all of it, his whole career, the true record of that drainage that he had never been allowed to put in the official one. He made me sit, and he made me read, while the light went down outside his window. And I am going to ask you to do the same thing now, to sit with me a moment before we go in, because once we go down into that valley there is no good place to stop. So if this story has its hooks in you, take the 1 second it costs to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Consider it the smart, easy thing, the thing that costs you nothing, the kind of thing that almost no one in these old files ever managed to do, which was to heed a warning while there was still time to heed it. They did not. You can. What I read in that box that evening rearranged something in me. The disappearances went back more than 60 years, far more than the official record acknowledged, because the official record had been quietly smoothing them into separate, unrelated tragedies the whole time, and running through them, in the witness statements that had never made it into any final report, in the accounts of the few who had been near a vanishing and lived, were the same details, repeated by people across 6 decades who could never have spoken to one another. They almost all mentioned a smell. A heavy, wet, rotten smell. like a dead animal pulled out of a river and left in the sun, that came down the valley ahead of whatever it was, on still air, with no wind to carry it. They mentioned a sound, described different ways, a wet dragging, a heavy sliding, something large moving through the rhododendron without the crack and snap that a bear or a man makes. And a handful of them, the ones who had been closest and somehow walked away, described seeing something pale, tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that was wrong, standing at the edge of the river or the edge of the trees in the last light, and not moving the way a living thing moves, and then, between one blink and the next, simply not there. Errol watched me read it. When I set the last clipping down, he leaned forward, the oxygen hissing, and he said the only thing he ever said to me about what it was, and he did not pretend to know more than he did. He said, "I do not know what it is, son. I quit trying to know. The old people in this country had names for it, river names, and they would not go down in that valley after the leaves turned. And I used to think that was ignorance, and it was not. It is something that has been in that drainage longer than any of us. It does not come up out of the valley. It does not need to. It just waits for the valley to bring it someone, and every few years it does." Then he gripped my arm with a hand that had gone thin and strong as wire, and he said, "If you are going down there, you go in daylight, and you do not let the dark catch you below the upper falls. You smell that smell, you turn around. Do you hear me? You do not go to look. Promise me you turn around." I promised him. I meant it when I said it. And the next morning, with a clear, cold sky and a weather window that would not last, I drove up to the high trailhead, and I signed my name in the register under Shane Coburn's, and I shouldered my pack, and I walked down into the valley to look for a man I was almost certain was already gone, carrying an old dying ranger's promise that I was about to break. I went in alone. I want to be honest about that, because people always ask why I did not take a team, and the answer is partly procedure and partly shame. The procedure answer is that the first sweep of a likely route is often a single experienced ranger moving fast and light, with a full team staged to come in once the search narrows. The shame answer is that I did not want a team in that valley with me, because I did not want anyone else to see what I was now half certain I was going to find. And I did not fully trust myself not to sound like a madman if I tried to explain to a county deputy why we needed to be out before dark. So I went down alone, with my radio, my pack, and Errol Sayer's voice in my head, and that was the first mistake, and I knew it was a mistake even as I made it. The trail down into the drainage is one of the prettiest walks in the wilderness for the first few miles. It follows the river down through open hardwood, the leaves long down now and brown underfoot, the water loud and cold over the rocks. I called Shane Coburn's name as I went, and checked the obvious places, the campsites, the river crossings, the spots where a person tends to come to grief. I found his sign by mid-morning, which both encouraged me and put the weight back in my stomach. A clear set of boot prints in a muddy stretch of trail, the lugs matching the description his sister had given of his boots. Headed down valley, confident, unhurried. He had made it this far and farther. The deeper I followed, the farther down into the cleft of the valley I went, where the ridges rose up steep on either side, and the spruce closed in, and the light went green and dim even at midday. By early afternoon I was below the upper falls, the line Errol had told me not to let the dark catch me past. I found Shane Coburn's first abandoned thing there, a trekking pole, a good one, lying in the trail, not dropped at the side, where it might have slipped from a pack, lying across the trail, square, the way nothing falls. I picked it up. 20 yards on, the other pole, the same way. Then his hat. Then, leaned against a spruce just off the trail, neat, upright, his pack, full, his food still in it, his sleeping bag, his stove. Everything a man needs to live. Set down careful against a tree, miles from anywhere, and the man gone. I have told you that I had read the files, that I knew the pattern. Let me tell you that knowing the pattern did nothing to soften the way it felt to stand over that pack in that green dim valley and understand that I was standing exactly where it always happened, that I had walked myself right into the middle of the thing I had read about by lamplight the night before. I keyed my radio to call it in. Below the falls, in the cleft of the valley, the radio gave me nothing but static, a rising and falling hiss, and I remembered that the files had mentioned that too, that the valley ate the radios, and I had always told myself that was the terrain, the steep walls, and standing there I no longer believed it was only the terrain. I should have turned around then. I had found the pack. The procedure was satisfied. The smart move, the move I had promised an old man I would make, was to mark the location, climb back up above the falls until my radio worked, and bring a full team in at first light. I did not do it. And the reason I did not do it is the reason that has cost me the most sleep, because it was not bravery, and it was not even duty. It was that some part of me, the same part that reads to the end of a thing it is afraid of, needed to know. 60 years of vanishings and an old man dying with the truth in a box, and I was the first one in all that time, standing at the exact place with the daylight still up, and I could not make myself walk away without seeing. God forgive me, I went on. The smell reached me about a quarter-mile below the pack. It came down the valley on still air, with no wind to push it, exactly as the files had said, and that wrongness, the smell arriving against still air, was the first thing that truly frightened me, more than the sight of it would have. It was a heavy, wet, rotten stench, like a deer carcass dragged out of the river and left to bloat, thick enough to taste, and it rolled over me in a wave and then thinned and then came again, stronger, as if its source were moving, slowly, somewhere ahead of me in the green dark along the water. Every animal instinct I own locked my legs. I stood in the trail and I did not want to take another step toward that smell, and I am telling you that the not wanting was a physical thing, a wall, the oldest warning the body has. I went on anyway, off the trail now, toward the river, drawn and repelled in the same breath, moving slow and quiet through the rhododendron, toward the place the smell seemed to come from. And that is when I heard it. Not a roar, not a scream. A wet, heavy, dragging sound, a great soft weight moving through the laurel and the shallows, slow, deliberate, with none of the sharp cracking of brush that a bear makes, just that sliding drag, and the slosh of something large in the edge of the river. It was close. It was just beyond a thick screen of rhododendron, down at the water, and it was big, bigger than a man, bigger than a bear, and I could hear it breathing, a low, wet, labored sound, in and out, and the smell of it was a physical pressure now. I did the only intelligent thing I did that entire day. I did not push through the laurel to see it. I went down, slowly, into a crouch behind the rhododendron, and I held still, and I made myself as small and silent as I have ever made myself, and I watched through a gap in the leaves. I am not going to be able to give you the clean, complete description that the part of you listening wants, and I have come to believe that not being able to is a mercy. The light was bad. The laurel screened most of it. What I saw, through that gap, at perhaps 40 feet, was a portion of something pale, the wet gray white of a fish belly, broad and humped, moving low along the far edge of the river in the green shadow. It was the size of a small horse, but it did not carry itself like any four-legged animal. The proportions were wrong, the bulk in the wrong places, and it moved with that horrible slow dragging fluidity, half in the shallows, and it had no shape that my mind could close its hand around. It stopped. The breathing stopped. And I understood, in a wave of pure cold horror, that it had stopped because it knew something was watching it, that whatever it was had the same animal awareness that I had, and that it was now, like me, holding perfectly still, listening, in the green dark, 40 feet away. We stayed like that, the two of us, for a length of time I cannot give you, both frozen, both listening, the smell of it filling up the whole world. And then, slowly, the pale bulk of it began to turn, in the shallows, toward the bank where I was crouched, toward me, and the wet breathing started again, and it was coming my way, unhurried, certain, the way you walk toward a thing you have already caught. I ran. I came up out of that crouch and I ran, away from the river, up toward the trail, and behind me I heard it come up out of the water, all at once, the slosh and the heavy drag of it surging onto the bank, fast now, far faster than that slow dragging had let me believe it could move, and the rhododendron crashing as it came. And I did not look back. I have never in my life regretted anything less than not looking back. I hit the trail and I went up it, up valley, toward the falls and the daylight and my dead radio and the long climb to the truck, running flat out with a full pack on ground that would turn an ankle in a heartbeat. And the thing came behind me, and the smell came with it, and the light was already beginning to go. I do not know how far it followed me. That is one of the things I have had to learn to live without knowing. I ran until my legs gave out, up above the falls. And when I finally fell against a tree and made myself turn and look, gasping, with my knife in my hand and nothing else, the trail below me was empty and green and silent, and the smell was gone, and the only sound was the river and my own heart trying to climb out of my chest. It had broken off, or it had never truly chased me and had only surged onto the bank to drive me. The way the files hinted it drove people, hurting them, and I had run the way it wanted me to run. I will never know. The not knowing is the splinter that has never worked its way out. I got above the falls, and my radio crackled back to life, and I called it in with a voice I barely recognized as my own. And I climbed the long miles up out of that valley in the failing light, with my skin crawling the whole way, certain every dim shape in the spruce was the pale bulk of it. And I reached my truck at the high trailhead in full dark. And I sat in the cab with the doors locked and the engine running and my hands shaking on the wheel for a long time before I could drive. We never found Shane Coburn. A full team went in the next day, in numbers, in daylight, and we recovered his pack and his poles and his hat from below the falls, exactly where I had found them. And we searched that valley as hard as any valley has ever been searched, and we found not one trace of the man himself. The river, we wrote, presumed drowned, body carried down and lodged somewhere we could not reach, never recovered. It is a thing the world believes, because the world wants to believe it, and I signed the report, and I have signed others like it since, and I will go to my own grave having signed lies about that valley, because the truth is not a thing you can put in a file without ending your career and your good name in the same afternoon. I did not tell the team about the smell, or the breathing, or the pale shape in the shallows. I told them I had found the pack and lost radio contact and come out at dark. All true. All a fraction of the truth. I have wondered since whether I owed Shane Coburn's sister more than that, and I have decided that I owed her mercy more than I owed her the truth, and that telling her what I believed took her brother would have been a cruelty dressed up as honesty. So I lied, gently, the way Errol taught me without ever saying so, and I let her grieve a drowning instead of the thing I cannot prove. I went to see Errol Sayre when it was over. He was weaker than he had been the week before, the lung disease tightening its hold. And he looked at my face when I came in and he knew, before I said a word, that I had broken my promise and gone below the falls, and that I had come back changed. He did not say I told you so. He let me sit, and he turned the brass compass over in his thin fingers. And when I had told him all of it, every part, the smell on the still air, the wet breathing, the pale bulk turning toward me in the shallows, he closed his eyes. And he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a thing he has carried alone for 50 years is finally shared. And he said, "So you do believe me?" It was not a question. And I said, "Yes, Errol, I believe you. God help me, I believe you." And something went out of him then, some long-held tension, and I understood that I had given him the one thing he had wanted, which was to not be the only living man who knew. Errol Sayre died that winter, quietly, in the chair by his window. He left me the box. It is in my own hall closet now, the old ammunition crate full of 60 years of the true record, and I have added to it, and I do not know who I will leave it to, and that is a problem I have not solved, and that frightens me almost as much as the valley does. Here is the part I have never put in any report, the part that is the real reason I am telling you all of this tonight. I left the backcountry work 2 years ago. My knees, I tell people, and the bad lungs that run in men who grow up in coal country, and those things are true enough. But the deeper truth is the valley. I could not keep walking into a wilderness that held that drainage, could not keep signing the reports, could not keep standing at the trailhead lying to the families. They have me at a desk now, down in town, doing the permits and the records, and I am near the mountains I love, and I no longer have to go down into the one part of them that I fear, and most days that is enough. But every November, when the leaves are down and the light goes thin and the air gets that still, cold edge, I find myself thinking about that valley. and about the smell that comes down it on still air, and about how it has been there longer than the railroad and the loggers and the wilderness designation and all of us, just waiting, patient, for the valley to bring it someone. And I think about the box in my closet and the names in it, 60 years of names, and how there will be more because the trailhead is still open and the register is still there. And every season healthy, prepared, experienced people sign their names in it and walk down into the prettiest valley in the wilderness, and some of them do not come out. And the report says the river, and the river says nothing at all. So, if you take one thing from an old ranger tonight, take this. If you are ever deep in the high Appalachian backcountry, far down in some beautiful remote valley with a cold river running through it, and the air goes still, and you catch on that still air a heavy, wet, rotten smell that has no business reaching you with no wind to carry it. Do not do what I did. Do not go to look. Do not need to know. Turn around and climb, and get yourself up into the daylight and the open air, and do not stop until the smell is long behind you, because the thing that smell comes from has been waiting in that valley a very long time, and it is patient and it is in no hurry at all. And the one mercy in any of it is that it lets you leave, if you are wise enough, just this once, to go. Most of them were not. I almost was not. And I have spent every quiet night since wondering whether I truly got away, or whether it simply decided, that one time, in that one valley, to let me carry the warning back out for it, to you, tonight. Sleep well, and stay out of the still valleys.